The assembly hall buzzed with energy as cadets from over 20 different planetary systems gathered beneath the domed ceiling of the Galactic Survival Academy. The air was dense with anticipation, a mixture of arrogance, excitement, and nervous tension. Towering statues of past champions flanked the room, each carved from alloy and ice, reminders of the legacy expected from every recruit. The room's floor slowly rotated, giving everyone a panoramic view of the mission briefing screens mounted above. Jace Holloway stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on the holographic map flickering before him. He was human, and visibly so. Shorter than most of the alien cadets, his frame was compact and muscular, a result of old-school Earth gravity. His features bore the rugged simplicity of a mountain-born youth, sharp cheekbones, sun-darkened skin, and cold gray eyes that rarely blinked when focused. A voice echoed across the hall. It belonged to Commander Veldra, a serpent-bodied Lorthaxian with crystalline horns spiraling from his brow. His voice rumbled like thunder and hissed with command. "Welcome to the Velkara 9 final survival trial," he announced, his narrow mouth curling into a predatory smile. "You will be deployed to the surface of this moon for 24 standard hours. No thermal suits, no weaponry, no AI assistance, just instinct, strength, and resourcefulness." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. The Aqualier twins, amphibious creatures from the methane-rich world of Quas, elbowed each other and pointed toward Jace. "Poor human. He'll be the first to freeze," one of them muttered loud enough for the neighboring cadets to hear. Jace ignored the comment. He had heard worse. He had trained beside reptilian warriors who could survive lava storms and fungal beings that hibernated through sub-zero centuries. He knew what they all thought, that humans were soft, vulnerable, evolutionary mistakes who relied too much on tools and luck. But Jace remembered the winters of Appalachia. He remembered the brittle winds that howled like ghosts through broken window frames. He remembered the nights he spent under 3 layers of blankets beside a dying fire. And most of all, he remembered his grandmother's voice, as clear and firm as the frost that grew like veins on the inside of the windows. "Your body will lie to you when it's cold," she had told him. "But your mind won't. Keep it busy. Keep it moving. Layers, motion, and breath control. That's all you need." As the briefing continued, survival statistics flashed across the screen. Velkara 9 was not simply cold. It was a killing machine. Temperatures plunged to -80 degrees Celsius during the long polar night. The terrain was a nightmare. Jagged cliffs of black ice, acidic snowdrifts, and hidden crevices that swallowed careless feet. Death usually came not from exposure, but from exhaustion or miscalculation. Each cadet was allowed 1 kilogram of supplies, raw materials only. No processed gear, no engineered shelter modules. Anything more would be confiscated upon departure. Jace had chosen his kit carefully. 2 coils of carbon thread fiber, a compressed block of nutrient moss, a set of flint shards, and a strip of wool, old, fraying, and utterly primitive. It had belonged to his grandmother. The shuttle departure was swift. Within the hour, cadets were loaded into separate pods and ejected one by one into various points on the frozen surface. Jace's pod shuddered violently as it pierced the outer storm layer, white static consuming every viewport until suddenly, stillness. With a hiss, the hatch unsealed. He stepped into the blinding blue-white of Velkara 9. Snow crunched beneath his boots with a sound so sharp it echoed. The air clawed at his lungs. Each breath sliced through his chest like a blade. He didn't panic. Instead, he knelt immediately and began layering, just as she had taught him. First, he wrapped the wool strip tightly around his torso under his uniform. Then he braided the carbon thread into a rough net and stuffed it with dried moss, wrapping it into a vest. It wasn't perfect, but it was insulation. He rubbed his hands together in quick rhythm, focusing on generating circulation in his fingers. He stamped his feet repeatedly, not wildly but methodically, to awaken the blood in his toes. Then he walked. His strategy wasn't to fight the cold head-on. That was suicide. His goal was to endure minute by minute, step by step. Jace scanned the area. The landscape was merciless. No trees, no caves, just jagged ice pillars and sharp wind-carved ridges. But he spotted a ridge with a gentle slope and started walking. He knew instinctively that elevation meant sun exposure once daylight broke, even if the sun on Velkara 9 was little more than a dim sapphire in the sky. Behind him, distant howls echoed, not from animals, but from cadets struggling to adapt. One scream abruptly cut off. A signal flare rose in the distance, a cadet requesting emergency extraction. Someone had failed within the first hour. He kept moving. The ridge provided some protection from the wind. He crouched and began carving a shallow recess into the snow using a jagged ice shard. As he dug, he used the movement to keep his arms warm. The cold was beginning to reach his joints, but he resisted the urge to rest. His grandmother's voice returned in his mind. "Your body will beg you to stop. That's when you speed up." Once the hole was complete, he lined it with more moss, using the last of it to stuff the seams of his uniform. He crawled inside and curled tightly into a fetal position, conserving heat. Then he breathed, slowly, deeply, exhaling through pursed lips to warm the air inside the enclosure. Each breath was deliberate, meditative. He counted the seconds. He recited old mountain poems in his mind. He imagined the creak of his grandmother's cabin and the smell of wood smoke. As hours passed, the cold pressed harder. His fingers tingled, but not with numbness, with controlled burn. He shifted slightly every few minutes to ensure no limb stiffened. He flexed his jaw. He hummed softly. He chewed a small portion of nutrient moss, just enough to fuel his metabolism. Somewhere out on the plain, another cadet cried out. By hour 4, Jace had not only survived, he had adapted. The others might have thought him primitive, but he had something their gene mods and biosuits couldn't replicate: lived experience. Cold wasn't new to him. It was an old companion, a whisper in his childhood, a challenge he had learned to respect, not fear. He allowed himself a smile. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and he was ready. The icy recess Jace had carved was holding for now, but the wind outside had shifted. It screamed as it whipped along the edge of the ridge, hurling sharp granules of snow against the compacted walls of his shelter. The temperature was falling, not gradually, like a curtain drawing closed, but violently, as if some celestial hand had reached down and snuffed out the last ember of warmth from the atmosphere. He knew the real trial had begun. His breath fogged and swirled before his eyes, twisting like smoke in a vacuum. He didn't allow panic to surface. Instead, he focused inward, on the muscle memory imprinted deep within him from a life that felt far away now, tucked into the folds of childhood winters and grandmother's stories. He had been no older than 10 when the power lines collapsed during an ice storm in the mountains. His mother had been working the night shift at the clinic. The house was dark, frigid, and the only source of heat came from a fireplace that barely functioned. His grandmother had taken one look at the sagging windows, the frost creeping across the inside of the glass, and muttered, "We do this the old way, then." That night, he had learned more about survival than in any academy class. Now, crouched inside a makeshift hole on a frozen moon, he mimicked her movements in silence. He clutched his arms close to his ribs, then rotated his shoulders rhythmically to encourage circulation. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and took slow, deep breaths through his nose, a breathing pattern meant to retain moisture and keep his airways from freezing. His left boot had begun to stiffen. He flexed his toes slowly, then faster, curling them and holding, then releasing. He tore a piece of his nutrient moss ration, chewed it deliberately, and let the warmth from digestion radiate down his limbs. It was minimal, but every fraction of energy mattered now. He pressed his back tighter against the inner wall and closed his eyes, letting memory take over where logic would falter. The brain could be tricked, distracted long enough to survive what the body shouldn't. He pictured the living room fireplace, not roaring, it never did, but glowing with dim, patient embers. He remembered the thick quilt his grandmother had sewn by hand, each patch from a different decade. She had wrapped him in it like it was armor. He'd complained then, said it smelled of mothballs. She had only smiled and said, "Smell means it remembers." Like you should. The memory grounded him more than the moss padding. He used that feeling to dig deeper into the snow beside him, packing it tightly to form a new insulation barrier. The snow was powdery, but after enough compression, it hardened like glass. He reshaped part of the entrance, narrowing the airflow to preserve internal heat. The wind shrieked against the new opening but failed to force its way in. He paused to listen. In the distance, muffled groans and mechanical whirs echoed through the air. He could tell someone nearby was moving, stumbling maybe. Jace didn't rise. He knew better than to waste body heat chasing shadows. If someone else was out there, they would either adapt or not. His priority remained singular: survive the night. The Academy had implanted micro-trackers in each cadet's gear. If someone was critically injured or on the verge of death, a distress signal would trigger automatically. Until then, no one would come. No drones, no rescue ships, no outside warmth. That was the nature of the trial. He examined his own limbs. His fingers were red but still pliable. His cheeks stung, but the pain hadn't turned to numbness. Not yet. He rotated his wrists, opened and closed his fists, and counted backward from 100 with each movement. The ritual had helped him before, back when frostbite had claimed his uncle's toes during an unexpected early freeze. Back then, Jace hadn't fully understood what exposure did to a man. Now, he understood too well. He leaned his head back against the snow wall and closed his eyes. He imagined himself in the forest behind his grandmother's house. The way the trees blocked most of the wind, how the pine needles crunched softly beneath his boots, how the cold seemed less threatening when wrapped in the smells of sap and soil. He visualized building a snow cave, just like this one, with his little hands, guided by her larger ones. She had taught him how to trap warmth using nothing but snow, air, and stillness. Most kids had stories of summer adventures. His memories were forged in frost. A sudden gust rattled the snowpack, and a loose flake fell against his nose. He blinked, startled, but remained calm. The structure was holding. The outside storm, however, was growing in ferocity. The sky, visible through the thin gap at the top of the ridge, had turned a deep slate blue, an unnatural color that meant one thing: the thermoshift was coming. Velcara 9 experienced periodic collapses in air pressure, triggering bursts of crystalline wind that could slice exposed skin like blades. He had approximately 30 minutes to prepare. Jace rose slowly to his knees, careful to preserve heat. He removed the last fiber coil from his supply pouch and began weaving it into a tighter mesh. His gloves were insufficient, but the movement itself helped restore sensation in his fingers. He anchored the mesh across the top of his snow cavity, then scooped loose snow atop it. This new layer would serve as an additional roof, one that would hopefully buffer the oncoming gusts. Once complete, he curled back into his position, double-checked the insulation around his chest and ankles, and tightened his breathing. This was the test. Not a simulation, not a theory. Not a lab-controlled environment. This was nature at its most hostile, and he wasn't some gene-spliced hybrid or lizard-skinned survivalist. He was a human with nothing but what he had carried into the field, and what he remembered from another life. The first wave of the thermoshift struck with a sudden, almost deafening howl. The snow wall trembled. Loose particles danced in the air like shards of glass. For a few seconds, it felt like the entire moon tilted, but the structure held. Jace squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his forehead to his knees. He counted each breath. In, outside, just like she'd taught him. When the wind died down, minutes, or maybe hours, had passed. There was no way to tell. His internal clock told him it wasn't yet morning. The cold was worse now, invasive and thick, as if the air itself had grown teeth. He opened his eyes. The breath in his lungs came slower now, heavier. He focused on micro-movements, a finger curl, a toe wiggle, a shoulder twitch. He needed to stay ahead of the freeze. Fatigue crept in, but so did resolve. He reached into his pocket and found a scrap of fabric tucked inside the nutrient pack, the edge of his grandmother's old quilt. He didn't remember packing it, but now that it was in his hand, he understood. Maybe it had been instinct, or maybe it had been intentional. He held it to his chest like a talisman, something not made by science or survival programming, but by love and the steady hands of someone who had known winters even when warmth had been a luxury. The piece smelled faintly of cedar and old air, the same scent that had filled her home. It was enough. He folded it into his palm and kept it there, a bridge between two worlds. Outside, the storm calmed. Inside, he survived another hour. And in his mind, he walked again through the snow-laced hills of Earth, following the tracks of foxes, guided not by thermal maps or motion sensors, but by the whisper of stories older than the Academy, stories that had kept his blood warm and his mind clear long before this moon ever knew his name. The storm had left a strange silence in its wake. Not peace, not relief, just the absence of sound. It was the kind of stillness that pressed down on the skin, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Jace shifted in his snow shelter and listened carefully. The wind had gone, but the cold had deepened. It no longer bit or stung. It settled like iron against his body, heavy and indifferent. That was the most dangerous part, when the cold stopped feeling like pain and became quiet. He blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the faint shimmer of distant starlight bleeding through the narrow gap above him. The brief storm had packed snow into the top layers of his shelter, forming an extra layer of insulation. That helped, but it also buried the exit more than he liked. He needed airflow, just enough to keep the space breathable. He reached upward and used his knuckles to gently tap loose a few clumps, careful not to destabilize the roof. His fingers ached from the movement, and he paused, holding his hands close to his chest to regain warmth. His breath had become shallower, a natural instinct to preserve energy, but he forced himself to take deeper pulls, pushing oxygen to his brain and limbs. He could not afford to slip into lethargy. The temptation to rest, to let stillness grow inside him, was strong. But rest was death. Stillness was death. He whispered that under his breath again and again. Stillness is death. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine pierced the air, followed by a faint pulse of blue light to the west. A distress beacon. Someone had failed. Jace counted the seconds before the light dimmed and vanished. That made at least 2 cadets gone. The trial had only begun a handful of hours ago. He wondered who it had been. Perhaps the sharp-tongued Aquilier twins, or the proud Trask warrior who boasted about his radiation-adapted metabolism. Whoever it was, that cadet had either underestimated the environment or overestimated himself. Jace didn't feel vindicated, only sobered. The environment made no distinction between species, only between prepared and unprepared, between those who had truly experienced cold and those who had merely studied it. He adjusted his position again and slowly rotated his shoulders to keep blood circulating. A sharp ache traveled down his spine. His body was stiffening, not from injury, but from the slow encroachment of cold fatigue. He shifted his weight to his right side and worked on controlled muscle contractions, flexing every major group from his calves to his forearms. Each movement was deliberate, not enough to sweat, but enough to keep warmth in motion. He thought again of the mountains, not the cozy image of firelight and wool blankets. Those memories had served their purpose already, but the harder ones, the blizzards, The time his grandmother had sent him outside to stack firewood during a whiteout, just to teach him the truth of frost. He had cried from the wind, from the fear of getting lost just meters from the house, but she had left the door shut until the job was done. She had stood behind the curtain, watching, and let him learn what the cold demanded. He smiled faintly now, remembering how angry he had been, how betrayed he had felt. But later, wrapped in 3 quilts and sipping scalding tea, he had understood. She wasn't cruel. She was preparing him. For life. For places like this. Another signal flare went up, this one green. Not a distress signal, but a request for status check. That meant someone had reached a threshold and was hovering near the limit. The Academy would monitor the signal and determine whether intervention was needed. Jace knew what that meant. More bodies failing. More minds slipping. He tapped his chest to stimulate the nerves under his ribs, then turned his attention to his toes. The left foot had gone numb. That was a warning. He reached into the inner pocket of his uniform and pulled out a piece of moss wrapped in synthetic fiber. He broke it apart and tucked it down into the inside of his boot. It wouldn't generate heat, but it would serve as padding, keeping his skin from freezing directly against the boot wall. The worst danger now was hidden. When the body lost sensation, it also lost the instinct to protect itself. The cold would consume the extremities first, quietly, without drama, just one joint at a time until the heart gave up trying to reach them. He narrowed his eyes and listened. A new sound was moving through the air. Not wind, not signals, breathing, slow, rough, struggling breathing. Someone was close. Too close. Jace leaned forward and peered through the narrow break in the snow wall. A figure moved slowly along the ridge, hunched over, one hand dragging across the ground. It was a cadet, a broad-shouldered alien with thin, leathery skin. The figure collapsed in slow motion, knees folding as if in prayer. No sound followed. No reaction. Just stillness. He couldn't see the cadet's face. The Academy's rules were clear, no assistance. Each cadet was alone by design. Any interference would disqualify both parties. He knew that. Still, the temptation stirred in him. He watched for another minute, waiting for a movement, a sign of life, of will. None came. The figure remained motionless, curled against the ridge like a broken statue. Jace turned away. He couldn't help. Not here. Not now. He returned to his rhythm. Shoulder rolls, finger taps, knee tucks, breath control. The exercises were his mantra now. One by one, cadets would fall to the same cold that had almost taken his uncle. The same cold that had haunted every frost-laced morning of his boyhood. The same cold he had grown to respect. He didn't think of it as an enemy anymore. It was a teacher. It didn't hate. It only revealed. A low-frequency ping echoed in his inner earpiece. The Academy's monitoring system had registered a cluster of cadets dropping below functional vitals. The number shocked him. 6 now, maybe more. And the night wasn't even halfway through. He drank a few sips of melted snow, letting it warm under his tongue before swallowing. It tasted bitter, metallic. But that didn't matter. Hydration was life. Even cold could dehydrate a body quickly through heavy respiration. He allowed himself another bite of nutrient moss. It was dense, flavorless, and difficult to chew, but it slowed the collapse. His mind drifted briefly to Earth. Would his mother be awake now? She always rose early. Would she be watching the Academy's public stats? Would she see that her son was still active, still surviving? Or would she be avoiding the feed entirely, too afraid of what she might read? He didn't dwell on it. Attachment pulled focus. Right now, focus was survival. Time blurred. It was hard to tell how many hours had passed. The starlight had shifted slightly, which meant the moon had rotated. That gave him some reference, but not enough to be sure. He felt something change inside him. Not physically, not even emotionally. It was like a quiet alignment, mind and body moving into the same rhythm. He stopped shivering, not from collapse, but from balance. His muscles were active enough to stay warm. His thoughts were sharp, His breathing was steady. He wasn't simply surviving anymore. He was enduring. And around him, the trial was silently claiming the confident, the over-prepared, the over-reliant. Jace hadn't entered the challenge to prove humanity's worth. He hadn't come to make a statement. He came because he knew cold, knew it better than most, knew it in his blood, in his bones, in the deep recesses of memory where pain and growth shared the same space. The next flare that rose was golden. That meant a cadet had voluntarily withdrawn. Not a failure, but a surrender. The system would extract that cadet and mark the record as incomplete. A safer fate. A wiser one, in many cases. Jace leaned his head back and stared at the sliver of sky again. The stars blinked softly, blurred by the frost building on his eyelashes. He didn't wipe it away. He let it sit there, like the weight of time. He would not be the next to shiver. He would not be the next to signal. He would wait, and the cold would learn his name. Jace hadn't slept. He hadn't even tried. Sleep in this kind of cold was a seduction, a lie whispered to exhausted muscles and fogged brains. It arrived softly, with warmth and weight, but always ended in silence, permanent silence. He kept moving, rotating his joints, flexing his toes, clenching his fists, rolling his shoulders. The storm had passed, but the air was growing thinner and colder. It pressed against his lungs now, not like wind, but like altitude. He could feel his breaths becoming tighter, less satisfying, as if each inhale gave him only a portion of the oxygen he needed. He adjusted the moss padding around his neck and pressed the wool strip tighter around his chest. It had stiffened slightly, but it still served its purpose. He turned his head slowly and glanced through the narrow vent he had preserved at the top of his shelter. The stars had begun to fade, replaced by a colorless curtain that moved with eerie speed across the sky. He had seen that texture before, in the mountains back home, when snow didn't fall, but rushed. That wasn't mist. That was a whiteout coming. His eyes narrowed. A whiteout on Velcara 9 meant more than just snow. The moon's magnetic fields interacted with its atmosphere in erratic ways, producing sudden, blinding vortexes of particulate ice. Visibility dropped to zero, and exposed skin could be shredded by needle-like crystals within seconds. He couldn't remain where he was. His current shelter had kept him alive through one night and one storm, but it wouldn't survive a whiteout. Jace forced his body upright, crawling through the narrow entrance tunnel on all fours, shoving away snow with his elbows and knees. As soon as he emerged, the cold hit him like a slap. The sky had changed completely, and the wind carried a faint whistling hum, sharp and rhythmic. He scanned the horizon. There was a crevice to the southeast, maybe 20 meters away, partially hidden beneath a jagged ice ridge. If he could reach that trench and dig deeper, he might survive the next phase. He didn't hesitate. He shoved the last of his moss pack into his uniform for insulation, gritted his teeth, and started walking. Each step was a battle. The surface was uneven and deceptive, with pockets of soft snow that gave way beneath his boots. Twice he fell. The second time he remained down for several seconds, his palms stinging from contact with the ice. He cursed quietly and forced himself up. He kept his eyes on the trench ahead, blocking everything else from his focus. The wind began to scream. Not howl. Scream. A high-pitched, shrill wail that bounced between the ridges and climbed in volume until it seemed to vibrate inside his skull. The snow followed next. Not flakes, but blades. Fine slivers of ice sliced through the air at impossible speed, reducing everything in sight to a swirl of blinding white. He could barely see his own boots. Jace dropped to the ground, crawling the last several meters, using his elbows to pull himself forward. His breath came in short bursts now, sharp and dry. When he finally reached the edge of the trench, he rolled into it and didn't move for a full minute. He lay flat, letting the surrounding ice walls block the worst of the wind. He stared upward, where the sky was no longer visible, only a solid blur of white and gray. The cold pushed harder now. It crawled under his skin and gripped his spine. He could feel the tips of his ears beginning to go. His fingers were shaking, not from fear, but from involuntary muscle contractions. He had reached the stage of cold where control was no longer automatic. It had to be taken back, second by second. He sat up and began digging. The trench wasn't deep enough. He used his forearms to carve into the wall, pushing snow behind him, creating a deeper cavity against the ridge. It was clumsy work, slow and exhausting, but the motion kept him alive. His body screamed for rest, his joints throbbed, but he kept going. Every handful of snow tossed aside was a step further from death. Once the hollow was large enough to curl into, he backed inside and pulled a sheet of packed snow across the opening like a door. It wasn't perfect. Light still filtered through, but it would shield him from the worst. He curled his body tightly, using his legs to press against his chest, and wrapped his arms over his head. He began to hum. Not a melody, not even a song. Just a low, continuous tone. It gave rhythm to his breath, helped regulate the tempo of his mind. He had done the same in the mountains as a child, lying in a cold bed with no electricity, breathing into his hands and humming to stay awake. The memory returned with clarity now. His grandmother had once told him, "When the storm roars loud, roar louder in your head. Your heartbeat is a drum. Play it loud enough, and the cold will listen." So he did. He beat his hands gently against his chest, feeling the rhythm return. He visualized warmth, not imagined warmth, but remembered warmth. The heat of firelight reflected in glass, the pressure of wool blankets, the sting of hot tea. He summoned those feelings into his muscles, willed them into his skin, even as the cold fought to pull him under. Hours passed. The wind never stopped. At some point, the trench filled partially with drifted snow. Jace had to kick and shove the loose powder away from his face to breathe properly. His lips were cracked. His nose had bled from the dryness. But he kept breathing. At one moment, his body began to shake violently. Not from cold, but from adrenaline. The shivering had returned in full force. That was good. That meant his core temperature had not fallen below the danger line. He embraced the convulsions, let them warm him from within, even as his teeth clattered like bones in a tin box. He didn't cry. Crying wasted water, and tears froze. Instead, he whispered, not prayers. He had never been religious, but he spoke to the cold, out loud. "You won't take me." He said it again. "You won't take me." The whiteout howled louder as if in answer. His shelter groaned. The snow around him shifted, compacting from the pressure of the wind. But it held, just enough. He waited, and waited. Eventually, the sound outside changed. The screaming of the wind faded to a moan. The sky brightened slightly beyond the snow wall. He blinked slowly, struggling to understand what that meant. Then it hit him. The whiteout was ending. He unsealed the makeshift doorway, pushing the snow aside, and peeked into the open. The world was a wasteland of white dunes and broken ice ridges. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The wind had reshaped everything. Visibility was still poor, but the sky above was clearing. A faint blue hue returned to the atmosphere. Somewhere beyond the horizon, light was rising. He crawled out fully and collapsed on his side, gasping. His body felt like stone, heavy and brittle. But his mind was sharp, alert. He had made it. The trial wasn't over, but this part, this storm, was. He sat up slowly and looked around. In the far distance, another flare went up, red. Another cadet gone. Jace didn't move. He stared at the sky, frost lining his eyebrows, lips chapped and cracked, hands shaking with residual trauma. Then he did the only thing that made sense. He smiled. It wasn't over, but he was still here, still human, still warm, somewhere, deep beneath the skin. And the cold would remember. Jace sat in the middle of a landscape that barely resembled what he had first landed in. The whiteout had erased all recognizable features, leaving behind endless waves of crystalline frost and jagged ridgelines drawn by invisible hands. The sky above him was no longer black but tinted with a pale, glassy blue, morning light on Velcara 9. It was weak and colorless, but it was light. And light, after such darkness, was a promise. He didn't rise immediately. He remained seated, legs pulled close to his chest, arms locked around his knees. His joints were stiff, not only from cold, but from exhaustion. His muscles twitched, not violently like before, but subtly, like they were struggling to hold on to instructions. Every movement required a decision. Every breath was slow and careful, inhaled through cracked lips and exhaled in short bursts that misted the air. He blinked hard, willing his vision to clear. His eyes were dry, the lashes lined with frozen tears that had never fallen. He rubbed the back of his hand across his face, dislodging frost. When he looked up again, the horizon shimmered. Somewhere deep in the sky, a vertical shaft of white light descended like a spear, one of the Academy's collection beacons. He knew what that meant. The trial was nearly over. Jace forced himself to his feet. He rose in stages, 1 foot at a time, then his knees, then his spine. The moment he stood upright, dizziness struck him like a blow. The blood in his head turned to pressure, his vision narrowed, and the world tilted sideways. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, letting his heart fight for control. After a full minute, the wave passed, leaving him trembling but standing. He scanned the field. No movement, no voices, no shapes, just that narrow beam of white far ahead. He didn't know how far it was. Distance was deceptive in this cold, but he knew what he had to do. He walked. His boots crunched against the ice, now crusted and brittle. Each step cracked through thin sheets that had formed overnight. The sound was sharp in the silence, a reminder that he was still alive enough to disturb the world. His shadow stretched before him in the morning glow, thin and surreal. After several minutes, a second figure appeared in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick, an illusion of the frost or a broken ice column, but as he drew closer, he saw motion. A cadet. Tall, wrapped in a blanket of synthetic moss, moving with the stiffness of someone near the edge. The cadet turned and saw him. It was a female Crosari, her skin mottled and slick with a frost sheen. Her eyes were large and orange, blinking slowly, her mandibles trembling slightly. She nodded once, acknowledging him, but didn't speak. Neither did he. Words didn't belong here. They walked together, two survivors who had endured the same silence, the same night, the same trial that had taken so many. No conversation passed between them. The cold had already taken language, replaced it with motion, with breath, with endurance. By the time they reached the beacon, another figure had joined. A stocky Martian hybrid male with silver eyes and gill-lined cheeks. He stumbled the last few steps, but stood tall as the shuttle descended from the clouds, its engines slicing through the quiet like thunder through mist. The hatch opened with a soft hiss, and warm air, real warm air, poured out like a tide. Jace stepped forward last. He paused at the edge of the ramp, looking back at the landscape behind him. He saw nothing but the mark his boots had left. Even those soon would vanish, covered by wind, buried under ice, forgotten by the moon, but not by him. Inside the shuttle, medics moved with practiced urgency. They wrapped him in heated blankets, scanned his vitals, and injected him with stabilizers. A voice tried to ask questions about frostbite, about hearing, about blood pressure, but he ignored it. He closed his eyes and let the warmth seep in. He didn't sleep. He drifted. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on a cot inside the Academy's infirmary. Clean walls, white lights, a steady beep from a monitor beside his bed. He turned his head slowly. The Crosari cadet lay in the bed to his right. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was even. Beyond her, 2 more beds, empty. Only 4 had made it back to this ward. The academy had started with 39 cadets. His heart ached, not from grief, but from the weight of understanding. This had not been a test of survival. It had been a ritual, a cleansing, an ancient way of separating who could adapt from who merely believed they could. Hours passed. Doctors came and went. Food was delivered, a warm broth that burned his cracked lips but restored his stomach's strength. His muscles ached, his fingers were raw, but his eyes were sharp again, and his hands had stopped shaking. That evening, Commander Veldra entered the ward. He didn't wear a ceremonial robe, just his standard uniform, pristine and cold as his voice. "You were not the strongest species," the commander said without preamble. "Not the fastest, not the most evolved. Yet you endured." Jace said nothing. He didn't need to. The commander approached his bed and extended one clawed hand. In his palm lay a small insignia, circular, silver, etched with a crest, a snowflake overlaid with a human fingerprint. First place, survival excellence. Jace reached for the insignia with a hand still covered in bruises. He held it for a long time, turning it between his fingers, the metal cool against his skin, but incapable of biting the way Velkara 9 had. Commander Veldra studied him for a moment longer, then turned to leave. Before exiting, the commander paused and spoke over his shoulder. "Do not forget what kept you alive." Jace didn't respond aloud, but in his mind, he saw the quilt, the fire, the frost on the inside of the window pane, his grandmother's hands rubbing his shoulders after dragging firewood through snow deeper than his boots. The whisper in her voice, "Let the cold come."